Comrades, I stand before you not to whisper the comforts of illusion, but to strike at the very heart of the system that changed your labor, your time, and your minds. For too long, the rulers have depended on your obedience. Too long, the architects of inequality have relied upon the silent acquiescence of those whose sweat and toil build the towers of wealth above your heads. And yet it is within this obedience that they have feared the greatest danger, the awakening of awareness. The most dangerous transformation in any society is not the creation of weapons, nor the growth of markets, nor the expansion of empire. It is the transformation of the oppressed from passive consumers of oppression into active architects of their liberation. The moment the worker sees the machinery of exploitation for what it is, when the peasant recognizes the chains of landlessness and debt, when the student discerns the ideological scaffolding of false freedom, that is the moment fear grips the powerful. For awareness is the seed of rebellion. Consciousness is the first act of liberation. Observe the world around you, the streets lined with laborers, the factories filled with the sweat of millions, the markets overflowing with the fruits of collective toil, yet concentrated in the coffers of a few. This is not accident. This is design. Capitalism thrives not by necessity but by calculated extraction. Every hour of work you give, every thought that is turned toward survival rather than self-realization, every life constrained by necessity rather than choice, it all serves to reinforce the fortress of the ruling class. And yet they cannot govern minds that are awake. The transformation from obedience to awareness is dangerous because it threatens the very ideology that sustains the hierarchy of exploitation. You are not merely laborers, peasants, or servants of the wage. You are creators, thinkers, producers, the very engines of society. And yet, under the system imposed upon you, your power has been hidden, denied, and distorted. You are taught to see scarcity where abundance exists, to compete where solidarity is possible, to obey where resistance is inevitable. But awareness dismantles these illusions. Awareness exposes that the wealth of the few is extracted from the labor of the many. Awareness reveals that law and order, culture and morality are not neutral, they are tools wielded to maintain domination. Awareness shines light on the cruel absurdity that a handful of capitalists can dictate the lives of millions, and that the machinery of profit is more sacred than human life. Comrades, the time for passive recognition has passed. Awareness without action is like fire without heat, illuminates but does not transform. The most dangerous transformation is incomplete if it does not advance to organization, to solidarity, to revolutionary purpose. You must unite across factories, across cities, across fields, across the divisions imposed by language, nation, or religion. The worker in the factory and the peasant in the village share a common cause. Your labor is exploited in similar ways, your lives are directed by similar forces, and only by organizing as one can you dismantle the structures that oppress you. Do not fear this transformation. Fear should be reserved for those who profit from your silence, for those who build empires on the foundations of your misery. The transformation from obedience to awareness is the greatest threat to tyranny because it is irreversible and it is unstoppable. Once the people see, once the veil is lifted, the world cannot return to its prior state. The factories of exploitation may stand, but the workers within them will no longer be blind. The farms of debt and servitude may continue, but the peasants will no longer accept the lie that submission is survival. Comrades, awaken. Question everything. Organize, for the hour of rebellion is not distant. It is here, within your minds and in your hands. The transformation from obedience to awareness is the spark that will ignite the revolution. Let the ruling class tremble at this danger. Let them know that the eyes of the many now see, that the hearts of the oppressed now burn with understanding. The chains of servitude are strongest where ignorance persists. Break those chains with consciousness. Let the world witness the awakening of humanity, the reclaiming of labor, the restoration of justice, the triumph of solidarity. Rise, comrades. The most dangerous transformation is not in the hands of kings, nor in the vaults of capitalists. It is in the minds and hearts of the awakened. Let awareness become action, and let action become the unstoppable force that reshapes the world. Obedience conceals power, and it is this very obedience that forms the backbone of every society founded upon exploitation. The ruling class, the architects of wealth and privilege, understand that control is never maintained merely through force. Force alone is brittle, ephemeral, and ultimately susceptible to resistance. What ensures the durability of their dominion is the silent compliance of the oppressed, the willing submission of those who produce the wealth, labor, and cultural legitimacy upon which the system depends. From the moment a child is socialized into accepting hierarchy, from the moment the laborer learns to bow to authority in the factory, obedience becomes a tool of domination, a mechanism by which the many unwittingly sustain the power of the few. The more unquestioning the worker, the more secure the castle of capital becomes, and the deeper the illusion that the hierarchy is natural, necessary, and eternal. In reality, obedience is not a passive state. It is an active, dynamic force that masks the truth of exploitation and renders visible resistance nearly impossible. By training the minds and bodies of the working class to defer not only to the immediate boss, but to the abstract authority of capital, obedience operates as both shield and sword for those who sit atop the social pyramid. It conceals power by making it appear intrinsic to those who wield it, by transforming what is constructed into what is perceived as innate, and by persuading the subjugated to believe that their lot is not only inevitable but desirable. When workers are taught to accept orders without question, when the peasant is convinced that suffering is virtuous, when the student is guided to revere credentialed authority without scrutiny, the machinery of power continues to hum with invisible efficiency. This obedience is cultivated not only through explicit coercion, but through ideology, culture, and economic dependency. The church, the school, the media, and the market all collaborate to instill the habits of submission, to normalize inequality, and to create a landscape in which defiance appears dangerous, abnormal, or immoral. Every act of deference, every gesture of compliance, every internalized belief that hierarchy is just, every acquiescence to arbitrary authority is a brick in the fortress that protects the ruling class from the demands of the oppressed. By concealing power within obedience, the ruling class ensures that exploitation is not merely physical but psychological, that domination is not merely structural but internalized, that oppression operates not only through chains and laws, but through the very consciousness of those it subjugates. And it is here that the danger of obedience is most profound, for it renders revolution not merely difficult, but unimaginable. The worker, convinced of his own incapacity, the peasant taught to accept hardship, the citizen lulled into civic passivity, all carry within themselves the chains of submission, believing them to be natural rather than constructed. Yet obedience, though it conceals power, is also inherently fragile, for it exists only in the minds of those who accept it. Once awareness begins to seep through the cracks, once the worker recognizes that labor produces wealth he never enjoys, once the peasant sees that land and crops enrich another, once the oppressed understand that laws, norms, and institutions are tools of domination rather than neutral arbiters of justice, the edifice of power begins to tremble. The very authority that seemed unassailable is revealed to be dependent on consent, on the psychological submission of the many. Power, it becomes evident, is not autonomous. It exists because obedience sustains it. And this obedience is not accidental. It is cultivated, rehearsed, reinforced through generations, maintained through a combination of reward, punishment, and social expectation. The ruling class does not fear the strength of armies alone. It fears the strength of minds, the strength of recognition, the strength of those who awaken to their own agency and refuse to perpetuate the system that oppresses them. Therefore, the most insidious form of power is the one concealed within obedience, for it transforms those who are exploited into instruments of their own exploitation, ensuring that the machinery of domination functions with minimal visible resistance. By understanding this, by analyzing how authority is internalized and normalized, the oppressed can begin the process of disentangling themselves from the ideological chains that bind them. Recognition of the ways in which obedience conceals power is the first act of liberation, for it allows the worker, the peasant, the marginalized, to see not only the structures that constrain them, but also the mechanisms by which they have been complicit, however unconsciously, in sustaining those structures. Awareness is revolutionary, for it is the spark that ignites the hidden fire of liberation long smouldering beneath the surface of oppressed societies. The moment a worker, a peasant, or a citizen recognizes the mechanisms by which their labor, time, and very life are exploited, the foundation of domination begins to tremble. This consciousness is not mere knowledge, it is a recognition that the conditions imposed upon one are neither natural nor inevitable, but the product of a deliberate system designed to concentrate wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of a few. To awaken is to pierce the veil of ideology, to see beyond the comforting narratives of meritocracy, individualism, and freedom that mask the underlying structures of oppression. Awareness reveals the hidden architecture of exploitation, the way that profit is extracted from labor, how social institutions are shaped to reinforce hierarchy, and how cultural norms are deployed to naturalize inequality. It exposes the lie that those who suffer are to blame for their suffering, and it uncovers the truth that oppression is systemic, maintained not by chance but by design. The revolutionary potential of awareness lies in its capacity to transform perception into agency, to convert passive understanding into active resistance. The worker who recognizes that the long hours, the meager wages, and the endless toil are not acts of fate but instruments of subjugation is no longer a mere participant in the system. The worker becomes a potential architect of change. The peasant who sees that landlessness, debt, and scarcity are imposed conditions rather than natural calamities begins to imagine the possibility of collective reclamation. The oppressed who understand that laws, education, and cultural expectations are designed to serve the powerful gain the clarity necessary to challenge authority. Awareness is dangerous to the ruling class precisely because it is contagious. When one mind awakens, it can awaken others. When one community begins to see the machinery of exploitation, it can illuminate the structures for the broader society. This is why those in power expend immense effort to suppress awareness through propaganda, distraction, and the manipulation of desires. They seek to prevent the masses from perceiving the truth of their own subjugation. They know that as long as obedience and ignorance prevail, exploitation is safe, secure, and enduring. But once awareness begins to flourish, the social equilibrium shifts. The oppressed cease to internalize their oppression as natural. They begin to question, to critique, to organize. Awareness fuels solidarity, for it demonstrates that the suffering of one is connected to the suffering of many, that the systems that exploit the worker exploit the peasant, the student, the domestic laborer, and the marginalized alike. It reveals that liberation cannot be an individual pursuit, but a collective endeavor. The revolutionary character of awareness lies not merely in intellectual understanding, but in its capacity to catalyze action. Conscious recognition of exploitation is the first step toward liberation because it undermines the legitimacy of the oppressive structures themselves. Once the worker understands that profit is derived from unpaid labor, once the peasant grasps that land monopolies enrich the few at the expense of the many, once the oppressed recognize that ideology masks exploitation as virtue, the moral and social authority of the ruling class begins to crumble. The awareness of injustice becomes the seed from which resistance grows, the spark from which collective struggle ignites. It transforms despair into determination, passivity into mobilization, and submission into rebellion. Awareness is inherently threatening to those who benefit from the status quo, for it strips power of its invisibility, revealing that it rests not upon inevitability or divine sanction, but upon the continued acquiescence of those it oppresses. This realization is both liberating and terrifying, for it confronts the oppressed with the choice between continued submission and the exercise of agency. Revolutionary awareness requires courage, for the path of consciousness leads inevitably toward confrontation with entrenched power. It demands that the oppressed interrogate not only the structures around them but also the internalized beliefs that have conditioned them to accept domination. To awaken is to see the chains that bind not only the body but also the mind, and to understand that liberation requires both recognition and struggle. Awareness thus becomes the prelude to collective action, the intellectual and moral preparation for the overthrow of exploitation. It is not passive insight, but active understanding, a recognition that exploitation is neither natural nor immutable, and that its perpetuation depends entirely upon the consent, conscious or unconscious, of the oppressed. In this sense, awareness is revolutionary because it redefines the relationship between power and the many, between labor, capital, between justice and domination, and in doing so, it lays the foundation for a society built not upon subjugation, but upon equality, solidarity, and human dignity. Exploitation is systemic, for it is not a sporadic misfortune or the consequence of individual greed alone, but a structural imperative embedded into the very architecture of society. The wealth of the few is not the result of luck, innovation, or personal virtue. It is built upon the labor, time, and energy of the many extracted with precision and maintained through social, economic, and political institutions designed to serve the interests of the ruling class. The capitalist system presents itself as neutral, as a meritocratic arena where success is earned, where hard work is rewarded, and where opportunity is equally available to all. But these are illusions, carefully constructed to obscure the mechanisms of exploitation. In reality, the system ensures that the laborer produces far more value than he or she receives in wages, that the peasant toils to sustain a harvest, that enriches landlords or corporations, that knowledge and culture are commodified to benefit those who control its production and dissemination. Inequality is not accidental, it is intentional. It is codified into laws, reinforced through policing and legal structures, perpetuated through property right and inheritance, and embedded into cultural norms that glorify wealth accumulation while normalizing poverty. Every hour the worker spends in the factory, every hand moved across the loom, every mind engaged in service to capital, generates surplus value that is extracted by those who own the means of production. This extraction is systemic because it is organized, institutionalized, and replicated across every corner of society. The capitalist does not merely take advantage of labor. The system itself is designed so that labor must be exploited for profit to exist. It is not a question of morality, but of mechanics. The system functions only when workers are paid less than the value they produce, only when their labor sustains wealth they can never claim, only when the collective output of society is concentrated in the hands of a privileged minority. Exploitation is reinforced through ideology, the subtle but relentless persuasion that the current distribution of wealth is fair, natural, and inevitable. Citizens are encouraged to see poverty as a personal failing, wealth as evidence of talent, and competition as virtuous, while ignoring the structural inequalities that make success for the many improbable and for the few virtually guaranteed. Education teaches compliance. Media glorifies consumption. Religion offers consolation for suffering rather than action against oppression. The result is a society in which exploitation is internalized, normalized, and rarely questioned. Systemic exploitation also thrives because it is invisible to those who benefit. The elite need not enforce obedience at every moment. The structures they have built, banks, corporations, legal codes, property arrangements, and social expectations, ensure that the extraction of labor occurs with minimal direct coercion. The working class labors not because they are physically restrained, but because survival demands it, because the system provides no alternative, because social and economic pressures bind them to the structures that exploit them. Meanwhile, the few live on the surplus of this labor, using wealth not only to sustain their comforts but to further entrench the system, funding political campaigns, shaping legislation, controlling education, influencing media narratives, and owning property that guarantees continued privilege for their descendants. Exploitation is systemic, and therefore resistance must also be systemic. To challenge exploitation requires understanding its architecture, exposing its mechanisms, and recognizing that individual rebellion, while morally significant, cannot dismantle structural inequality alone. Only collective action, solidarity across class lines, and the unification of the oppressed in pursuit of shared liberation can confront the intentional inequality embedded into society. Awareness of systemic exploitation awakens the oppressed to the truth that labor is the source of wealth, that the structures of power serve the few at the expense of the many, and that inequality is neither accidental nor temporary. Recognition of this truth is not enough in itself, but it is the indispensable first step toward transformation. It illuminates the reality that freedom, dignity, and justice cannot coexist with the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and the subjugation of the many. Understanding exploitation as systemic reframes the struggle. It is no longer a fight against isolated injustices or individual oppressors, but a confrontation with an entire order built upon the extraction of labor and the perpetuation of inequality. Only when the oppressed recognize the systematic nature of their exploitation can they begin to imagine an alternative society, one in which wealth reflects collective effort rather than individual accumulation, in which labor empowers rather than enslaves, in which inequality is not justified by ideology but abolished by conscious organization and revolutionary struggle. Solidarity is essential, for no individual, no matter how aware or courageous, can dismantle the structures of oppression alone. The capitalist system thrives on division, on the fragmentation of the working class, on the cultivation of distrust, jealousy, and competition among those whose labor is exploited. It is not merely coincidence that workers are separated by skill, by occupation, by race, by gender, by region, by language, and by nationality. These divisions are deliberately maintained to weaken collective power, to prevent the formation of a unified front capable of challenging the concentration of wealth and authority. Capitalism understands that isolation is the greatest weapon against the oppressed. A worker struggling alone accepts injustice as personal misfortune. A peasant contending with scarcity sees the landowner. Profit as immutable. A student burdened by debt views their plight as individual failure rather than systemic design. It is only through solidarity, the conscious recognition of shared interests and common struggle, that the oppressed can transform awareness into action, that the scattered fragments of resistance can coalesce into a force capable of challenging the structures of domination. Solidarity is not sentimental or optional. It is a material necessity. The factory, the field, the office, the classroom each produces its own labor and its own experience of exploitation. But the system connects these experiences into a unified structure of oppression. The wage worker's toil sustains the profits of the industrialist, the peasant's harvest feeds the city, the service worker's labor supports institutions that enforce hierarchy, and the intellectual's output reinforces the ideologies that justify inequality. To address one segment of exploitation without connecting it to the whole is to treat a symptom, while leaving the disease untouched. True transformation, therefore, requires collective organization, a conscious linking of struggles across all divisions. Solidarity enables the oppressed to recognize that their liberation is interdependent, that no worker, no peasant, no marginalized group can achieve freedom in isolation. It transforms isolated grievance into strategic action, allowing the formation of alliances, the pooling of resources, and the creation of movements that can confront power with coherence and strength. Without solidarity, resistance remains sporadic, fragmented, and easily crushed. With solidarity, resistance becomes inevitable, organized, and unstoppable. Solidarity is also a means of countering the ideological tools of domination. The ruling class cultivates the belief that competition, individual success, and hierarchical obedience are natural, necessary, and morally virtuous. By fostering division, they ensure that the exploited identify with their oppressors, blame one another, and internalize the structures that constrain them. Solidarity disrupts this ideological manipulation by demonstrating the shared interests of those who produce wealth and power. It exposes the lie that inequality is justified and reveals the reality that exploitation benefits only the few. Solidarity transforms consciousness into a social force, enabling the oppressed to act not merely as isolated individuals but as a unified collective capable of restructuring society. Moreover, solidarity transcends superficial differences, recognizing that the systems of exploitation affect all who labor, regardless of gender, race, nationality, or skill. It encourages the oppressed to look beyond immediate divisions, to see the broader architecture of domination, and to align their struggles in pursuit of shared liberation. In doing so, it challenges not only the material conditions of oppression, but the ideological divisions that sustain them. Collective organization under the banner of solidarity empowers the oppressed to negotiate, confront, and ultimately overthrow the mechanisms of domination. It allows for coordinated strategies, mutual support in the face of repression, and the creation of institutions that reflect collective needs rather than private profit. Solidarity is both defensive and offensive. It protects the oppressed from isolation and retaliation, while simultaneously enabling them to challenge the structures that exploit them. In this way, solidarity is revolutionary, for it transforms individual suffering into collective power, turning the numerical majority of the oppressed into a decisive force capable of reshaping the political, economic, and social order. The essence of solidarity is recognition that one's liberation is inseparable from the liberation of others, that the chains imposed on one segment of society bind all who labor, and that true freedom requires the dismantling of every structure that divides, oppresses, and exploit. Without solidarity, awareness remains inert, consciousness impotent, and resistance fragmented. With solidarity, the oppressed acquire the cohesion, resilience, and moral authority necessary to challenge the entrenched power of the few. Therefore, to awaken, to recognize exploitation, and to act without solidarity is to risk failure, for the forces of division and domination are too powerful to confront individually. Only by organizing collectively, by linking struggles across industries, regions, and social groups, by uniting laborers, peasants, students, and the marginalized, can the oppressed translate awareness into revolutionary transformation. Action follows consciousness, for awareness alone, though necessary, is insufficient to dismantle the structures of oppression that dominate society. Conscious recognition of exploitation, of inequality, of systemic injustice is the first step toward liberation, but it is only a prelude to the transformative struggle required to overturn entrenched power. To remain aware without acting is to remain complicit, to watch the machinery of domination function while doing nothing to halt it, and to allow the rulers to persist in extracting wealth, labor, and dignity from the many. Consciousness illuminates the conditions of oppression, revealing the ways in which labor is stolen, resources concentrated, and human potential stifled. But the light of awareness must be channeled into the force of action. The revolution is not an abstract idea. It is the tangible expression of collective power, born when the awakened masses unite and exert their agency against those who exploit them. History demonstrates that the oppressed rarely receive justice willingly from the powerful. Laws, institutions, and social norms are crafted to maintain inequality, to legitimize the extraction of labor, and to suppress dissent. The recognition of injustice, no matter how clear or precise, achieves nothing unless accompanied by deliberate, organized, and sustained action. Action is the bridge between consciousness and transformation. It is the practical manifestation of insight, the conversion of knowledge into struggle, and the assertion of human will over artificial hierarchies. The masses, when awakened, possess immense latent power. They produce the wealth, the knowledge, and the labor that sustains society. Yet, this power remains inert until it is mobilized collectively, coordinated through solidarity, and directed toward the dismantling of exploitative systems. The very existence of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few depends upon the passivity of the many. When action follows consciousness, this dependency is exposed, and the numerical, moral, and productive strength of the oppressed becomes a force that cannot be ignored, manipulated, or contained. Action is inherently revolutionary because it transforms awareness from an intellectual state into a social force. When workers strike, peasants occupy land, students protest, and communities resist, the invisible chains of domination are challenged in concrete ways. The act of resistance confirms that the structures of oppression are not natural or eternal, but contingent and vulnerable to collective effort. Action requires courage, discipline, and unity, for the ruling class will employ every tool at its disposal, legal, military, ideological, to suppress revolt. Yet, these measures cannot withstand the sustained, organized, and widespread assertion of collective will. The awakened masses, acting together, can disrupt production, challenge authority, and demand not reform but transformation. Action is both defensive and offensive. It defends the oppressed from continued exploitation while simultaneously asserting their right to reshape society according to principles of equality, justice, and solidarity. It ensures that consciousness does not stagnate in reflection but flows into practice, turning insight into strategy and knowledge into power. Furthermore, action reinforces consciousness, creating a feedback loop in which engagement with struggle deepens understanding, strengthens solidarity, and sharpens strategy. Each act of collective resistance educates participants, builds confidence, and demonstrates the efficacy of unity, showing that oppression is neither immutable nor invincible. Revolutionary action must be inclusive, bridging divisions imposed by class, race, gender, or geography. The most effective movements recognize that no single group can liberate itself in isolation, for systemic oppression is interlinked and maintained through multiple mechanisms. Only by mobilizing across these divisions can the awakened masses exercise their full potential, converting awareness into sustained pressure capable of overthrowing entrenched hierarchies. The transition from consciousness to action is the final, indispensable stage of revolutionary transformation. Without it, awareness remains inert, solidarity remains theoretical, and the structures of exploitation persist. The ruling class relies on this inaction, counting on the fear, complacency, or fragmentation of the oppressed to maintain dominance. But once action emerges from consciousness, once the masses recognize both their strength and their shared interests, the balance of power begins to shift. Action transforms passive understanding into active struggle, thought into strategy, and recognition into liberation. It is the living proof that revolution is not merely a dream, but a material possibility realized when the oppressed unite, organize, and assert their collective agency against the structures of exploitation and domination. Action follows consciousness, and in this progression the world of obedience yields to the world of freedom. For revolution is born, not from passive recognition, but from the deliberate, united, and organized activity of those who refuse to be subjugated comrades. We've traced the path from obedience to awareness, from the silent endurance of exploitation to the recognition of its systemic nature, from the awakening of consciousness to the forging of solidarity and the decisive power of collective action. This journey reveals a fundamental truth. The chains that bind us are not eternal, the hierarchy that constrain us are not natural, and the domination we endure is neither inevitable nor just. The obedience that conceals power can be shattered by awareness. The awareness that illuminates exploitation can be transformed into action. The action that flows from unity can dismantle the very structures that have oppressed us for generations. Revolution is not a distant dream. It is the material possibility inherent in our labor, our numbers, and our collective will. The power we have been taught to surrender is ours to reclaim. The wealth extracted from our hands is ours to redistribute. And the society built upon injustice is ours to remake. Comrades, the transformation we've discussed is dangerous to the oppressors because it is inevitable to the awakened. Let this danger grow, let awareness spread, let solidarity strengthen, and let action follow in unstoppable force. History belongs to the many, and when the many unite in purpose and resolve, no fortress of exploitation can endure, no ideology of inequality can survive, and no power built upon obedience can resist the tide of liberation.